The day I found a $5,000 utility bill sitting in my mailbox like a coiled rattlesnake was the day I realized my HOA had finally lost its collective mind. But what they didn't in Oppos, T realized was that they just declared war on the one guy in this neighborhood who actually knows how the lights stay on. I'm standing there in my gravel driveway, my work boots still heavy with the dust of a 12-hour shift and the smell of copper wire clinging to my skin, and I'm staring at this piece of paper that's essentially trying to steal my daughter's future right out from under us. $5,000 for electricity in a house where I religiously flick off every switch because every cent saved is another brick in the wall of my daughter's college fund. And the sheer, metallic taste of fury starts rising in my throat as I hear the HOA's automatic sprinklers hiss to life across the street, paid for with our fees while they were literally sucking the lifeblood out of my bank account. My name is Elias Thorne, and I'm what you'd call quote, dirt under the fingernails, and quote, electrician, a third-generation Sparky who's been running current through walls since I was old enough to hold a screwdriver. And let me tell you, when you spend 30 years tracing shorts and fixing botched DIY jobs, you develop a sixth sense for when someone's trying to pull the plug on you. 3 years ago, I lost my wife, Clara, in a wreck that turned my world into a mess of static and silence. And since then, my entire universe has revolved around my 17-year-old daughter, Maya, who's got her mother's laugh and a brain for calculus that makes my head spin. We moved to Oak Haven Heights seeking peace, a place with manicured lawns and the kind of quiet security that's supposed to come with a hefty monthly HOA fee. But what we got instead was a front row seat to a suburban dictatorship run by a woman named Victoria Sterling. Picture a woman who wears pressed linen suits to check her mail and treats a blade of grass over 3 inches like a personal insult to her dignity, driving a silver Mercedes with a vanity plate that reads, and quote, owner, 1, and quote, as if she personally held the deed to every soul in the zip code. Victoria didn't end Oppos. T just run the board. She was the board, and she spent her days patrolling the cul-de-sacs with a digital camera and a ruler, looking for any reason to slap a fine on a hard-working neighbor just because she could. For 2 years, I played nice, kept my head down, and paid the, end quote, fines, end quote, for my trash cans being out 10 minutes too long or my garden hose not being coiled in a, end quote, harmonious spiral, end quote. But this bill was different. This was a calculated attempt to break me. I remember walking into the HOA office the next morning, the air conditioning humming with a smug sort of efficiency, and Victoria was sitting behind her mahogany desk looking at me like I was a stain on her expensive rug. End quote, Mr. Thorne, end quote, she said, her voice like silk wrapped around a razor blade, end quote. It seems you're into Oppos, industrial grade in Oppos. Workshop has finally caught up with your utility obligations, and the board has determined that your excessive consumption constitutes a commercial surcharge, end quote. I just stood there, my hands deep in my pockets to keep from trembling, and I asked her how a few power tools used for weekend hobbies could possibly rack up a $5,000 surge in 30 days. And she just smiled that tight, Botox-frozen smile and told me that, end quote. Interpretation is at the board's discretion, end quote, before suggesting I might need to sell the house if I couldn't end Oppos to afford the lifestyle here. That was the spark that lit the fuse, because you don't tell a man who's grieving a wife and protecting a daughter that he's not good enough for his own roof. So I did what any self-respecting electrician would do. I went home and I started tracing the wires. I spent the next 3 nights in the dark with a thermal camera and a circuit analyzer, crawling through crawl spaces and checking transformer loads, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a massive, undocumented power draw coming off the main line that fed the community clubhouse, but the clubhouse was supposed to be closed for, end quote, renovations, end quote, yet the meter was spinning fast enough to power a small factory. I called in a favor from an old union buddy, Miller, who's been a lineman for the city for longer than Victoria's been alive, and we met at midnight behind the community pool, the air thick with the smell of chlorine and damp earth. Miller took one look at the junction box behind the clubhouse and whistled through his teeth, pointing out a series of illegal, high-voltage bypasses that were buried 6 inches underground, leading straight toward the back of Victoria's property. End quote, Elias, end quote. He whispered, his flashlight beam dancing over the botched soldering and the melted insulation, end quote. Whoever did this is a hack. but they're pulling enough juice to run a data center or a commercial kiln, and they've wired it so the cost gets distributed across the residential grid, specifically targeted to your transformer leg." End quote. The realization hit me like a live wire. She wasn't an oppos. T just overcharging me. She was using my house as a literal battery to fund whatever secret project she had going on behind those high cedar fences. But I couldn't in oppos. T just called the cops. Not yet, because Victoria had the local council in her pocket and a legal team that could bury me in paperwork before I could even file a report. So I needed more than just wires. I needed the paper trail. That's when my neighbor, Arthur, a retired widower who usually spends his days feeding birds and minding his own business, showed up at my door with a dusty cardboard box and a look of pure, unadulterated guilt. End quote. My wife was the treasurer before Victoria and oppos. Restructured in oppos. The board 3 years ago, end quote. Arthur told me, his voice shaking as we sat at my kitchen table, the light from a single bulb casting long shadows over the documents he started pulling out. End quote. She knew something was wrong, Elias. She kept these copies because she didn't into oppos. T trusts the digital audits, and then she got sick. I was too tired to fight it then, but seeing what she's doing to you and Maya, I can't stay quiet anymore. End quote. Inside that box was the history of a criminal empire disguised as a neighborhood association. Bank statements showing, end quote, maintenance, end quote, fees being funneled into a shell company called and oppos, Sterling Aesthetics, and oppos, and records of board meetings that never actually happened, with forged signatures from residents who had moved away years ago. But the real kicker, the absolute, end quote, nuclear, end quote, piece of evidence, was a series of photos Arthur's wife had taken of a massive, industrial-grade glass-blowing studio Victoria had built in her, end quote, guest house, end quote, a hobby that required massive amounts of heat and even more electricity. She was selling high-end artisan glass online for thousands of dollars apiece, all while the neighbors she looked down on were footing the bill for the kills that fired them. I looked at Maya, who was sitting at the counter trying to focus on her homework, but clearly listening to every word, and I saw the worry in her eyes, the fear that we were going to lose the only home she had left, and I felt a cold, hard calm settle over me. End quote. Maya, honey, end quote. I said, end quote, pack your bag and go stay with your aunt for the weekend, because things are about to get a little dark in Oak Haven Heights, end quote. I spent the next 48 hours doing what I do best, re-engineering the flow of power, and I didn't in oppos. T just cut the lines, oh no, that would have been too simple. I waited until the night of the, end quote, annual Founders Gala, end quote, an event Victoria used to parade her, end quote, charitable, end quote, works in front of the local elite, and while she was standing on that clubhouse stage in a dress that probably cost more than my truck, I was in the underground vault with a pair of insulated cutters and a very specific plan. I didn't in oppos. T just turned off the lights. I rerouted the entire illegal bypass through a series of step-down transformers I'd rigged, so that when she went to flip the switch for her grand, end quote, unveiling, end quote, of a new community fountain, every single one of her illegal kills back at her house would hit a feedback loop. I stood there in the shadows, watching through the clubhouse windows as the room went pitch black, followed by the most beautiful sound I've ever heard, the distant, muffled thump of a commercial circuit breaker exploding at Victoria's estate. The screaming started almost immediately, not from the guests, but from Victoria, who realized her precious glass studio and the evidence of her theft was currently being fried by the very grid she'd been milking for years. I walked into that ballroom with a flashlight in one hand and the box of Arthur's documents in the other, and as the emergency lights flickered on, casting a sickly yellow glow over the scene, I met her eyes. She looked like a cornered animal, her hair coming loose, her composed mask finally shattered, and I just handed the box to the city councilman standing next to her and said, and quote, I think you'll find in oppos, commercial surcharge in oppos, is actually located at 102 Sterling Lane, and the bill is long overdue. End quote. The fallout was spectacular. The police arrived within 20 minutes, followed by the fire department, because the feedback loop had sparked a small, contained fire in her illegal wiring that the fire marshal later described as, end quote, a textbook example of criminal negligence, end quote. The forensic accountants found over $400,000 in embezzled funds, and the, end quote, forged, end quote. Board members were more than happy to testify once they realize their names have been used to commit federal mail fraud. Victoria didn't end Oppos. T just lose her house. She lost everything, including her owner, one vanity plate, which I hear she doesn't in Oppos. T get to use on the prison transport bus. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night, and why I want to tell this story. It's been 6 months since the board was dissolved and we got our restitution checks, and the neighborhood is quiet again, but the new board is already talking about, standardizing, the color of our front doors to, increase property value, I look at the empty lot where Victoria's house used to stand, and I wonder, did I really fix the problem, or did I just clear the brush for the next person who thinks a little bit of power gives them the right to own their neighbors? I'm curious what you guys think. Was I right to take the law into my own hands and, electrocute, her business? Or did I risk too much of my daughter's safety just for a moment of high-voltage revenge? We all like to think we'd be the hero in this scenario, but when you're standing in the dark with a pair of wire cutters, the line between justice and just being another bully is thinner than a copper filament. Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever had to go to war with an HOA, and tell me, how far is, too far, when it comes to protecting your home? I'll be reading the responses, and believe me, after what I've been through, nothing surprises me anymore. If you want to hear more about how ordinary people are taking back their neighborhoods, hit that subscribe button. But for now, just remember, always check your meter because you never know who else is plugging into your life.